She demanded the DNA test to prove her son wasn't the father. But what it actually revealed was a 30-year-old lie that destroyed not just one marriage, but exposed a secret so devastating that two entire families would never speak again. Margaret Collins had been suspicious from the moment she heard her daughter-in-law was pregnant. She was so convinced that her son David wasn't the father of this child that she slammed her fist on the table during a family dinner and demanded a DNA test. "This child is not from our bloodline," she shouted. But the results in that envelope would reveal not only the baby's father, but a horrifying truth that had been hidden for 30 years. Welcome to Still Human. Here, we share human truths that emerge in life's most complex moments. Sometimes it's a DNA test. Sometimes a single phone call. Sometimes just being in the right place at the right time. We tell stories that show the depths of humanity. Stories you'll never forget. Before we begin today's story, please write in the comments where you're listening from. Which city are you following us from? We want to know what these stories mean to you. Margaret Collins had never loved her daughter-in-law. From the day Lisa married her son David, she felt this woman was wrong for their family. But the evening Lisa announced she was pregnant at dinner, Margaret's suspicions took on a completely different dimension. "I'm 6 weeks pregnant," Lisa had said, holding David's hand tightly. Margaret, frozen in the kitchen, began rapidly calculating dates in her mind. Wasn't David on a business trip during that time? 3 whole weeks in Los Angeles. She stayed awake that night. The next morning, she began examining David's old phone bills. She noted dates, tried to remember David's work schedule during that period. Every calculation led to the same conclusion. David wasn't home during that critical period. But what Margaret didn't know was that her calculations were missing a much bigger truth. A truth that, when learned, would change not only Lisa's life, but her own forever. Lisa had noticed the change in her mother-in-law's behavior. Margaret no longer looked at her properly, wasn't asking questions about the pregnancy process. Tense silences formed at dinner, with David caught in the middle. "Your mother is acting strange toward me," Lisa told David one evening. "She looks at me like I'm trying to hide something." David tried to defend his mother. "She just needs time to adjust. She was a bit distant even before you got pregnant." But David was lying. In his last conversation with his mother, Margaret had openly expressed her doubts. "Is this child really yours, David? The dates don't add up at all." David had gotten angry. "Mom, what does this mean? Of course it's my child." "Then prove it," Margaret had said, with cold determination in her eyes. "Get a DNA test." What David didn't know was that his mother's suspicions were rooted much deeper. In Margaret's mind, there were questions that went back much further than just this pregnancy. Questions that, if answered, would have the power to destroy everyone. Margaret couldn't sleep after that night. She began researching to confirm her own suspicions. She pulled out old photos, examined the periods around David's birth date. She discovered something strange. There were small inconsistencies in the hospital records from when David was born. She began questioning her own marriage. She tried to remember what her husband Robert was doing during that period. In the summer of 1993, he had taken a long business trip, exactly 9 months before David's birth. But then she noticed another detail. The calculations between Robert's travel dates and David's birth didn't seem to match up. Was her memory wrong? Or... That night, Margaret rummaged through her husband's old work files. When she found the documents she was looking for, she noticed her hands were trembling. The dates. The dates didn't match at all. Robert was home during that period. Then why couldn't she remember David's birth so clearly? And just then, a much more terrifying possibility came to mind. What if David really wasn't Robert's son? What if her own son was actually someone else's child? At the family dinner the following week, Margaret couldn't wait any longer. She slammed the table and silenced everyone. "Enough! I can't continue these lies any longer. Lisa, that child isn't David's, is it?" Everyone at the table was shocked. Lisa started crying. Margaret, you're crazy. Of course it's David's child. Then get a DNA test, Margaret said with cold determination. Right now. Let's settle this matter once and for all. David jumped up. Mom, you've lost your mind. You can't demand such a thing. But I am demanding it. Either you get this test done, or I have nothing to do with this family. Robert had never seen his wife so determined before. Margaret, what are you doing? This is very wrong. What's wrong? Margaret said, her eyes blazing. Are the lies that have been going on for 30 years, and I'm going to learn the truth now. But no one at that table could guess that when Margaret learned the truth, she would be the one who suffered the most damage. After 2 weeks of arguments, the family decided to get the DNA test. David and Lisa agreed to silence Margaret. Robert was uncomfortable with his wife's insistence, but didn't object. When test day arrived, everyone was tense and silent. The lab technician took samples from David, the baby, and at Margaret's insistence, from Robert as well. Results will be ready in 7 to 10 days, the technician said. We'll send them to you by email. That week, the house was like hell. Margaret constantly checked email at the computer. David and Lisa stood side by side trying to weather this crisis. Robert came home early from work, trying to... Have you thought about what will happen when the results come? Robert asked one evening. What if you're wrong? Margaret looked at him. I'm not wrong, and you know it too. Robert's expression changed at that moment, as if there was a hidden meaning in Margaret's words, but he didn't say anything either. However, the truth Robert was hiding was much more complex and destructive than Margaret's suspicions. On the morning of the 10th day, the envelope arrived. When Margaret opened the envelope with trembling hands, the page inside was filled with tables and percentages she didn't understand at first. When she began reading the results, the first lines were as she expected. David was not the baby's father. Margaret was right. But when she turned to the second page, she froze. The results on the third page made her collapse completely. David was not Robert's son. Margaret's world collapsed in an instant. The son she had raised for 30 years was not her husband's child. But how was this possible? Robert was home during that period, not traveling, and just then she realized the much more horrifying truth. If David wasn't Robert's son, then whose son was he? She grabbed her phone and had to make the most difficult phone call of her life that day. Robert, come home immediately, right now. Robert, hearing the panic in Margaret's voice, immediately left work. When he got home, Margaret was waiting in the living room, holding the DNA test results in her hand. Read it, she said simply. When Robert read the first page, he wasn't surprised, so it really wasn't David's child. You were right. Read the second page. When Robert saw the second page, his face turned white. The paper in his hand began to tremble. How is this possible? You tell me, Margaret said with 30 years of accumulated anger in her eyes. David is not your son. Then whose son is he? Robert's lips trembled. I don't know. Maybe the laboratory made a mistake? Robert. Margaret's voice was ice cold. Do you remember the time in our 30-year marriage when you lied to me? Is this one of those times now? And Robert collapsed at that moment. He put his head in his hands and began to cry. Margaret, so many years have passed, I didn't know how to tell you anymore. Margaret felt like a knife had been stabbed into her heart. How to tell me what? David is your brother Michael's son. Margaret's world completely collapsed. Her brother Michael was David's real father. How, when? How can such a thing be possible? Robert tearfully explained, in the summer of 1992, you were pregnant, but you miscarried. Do you remember? Those were very difficult days. Margaret remembered. She had been in depression for months after that miscarriage. Michael was visiting frequently during that period. You were very bad. I had to go to work. Michael was taking care of you. Continue. Margaret's voice was cracking. One day when I came home, you were together. You were in a very weak state, Margaret. You were using antidepressants. You weren't aware of what you were doing. Margaret's head was confused. Her memories from that period were very blurry. Michael left town the next day. He begged me not to tell you anything. 2 weeks later, you found out you were pregnant again. We were so happy. I forgot the truth, too. You forgot for 30 years? Margaret jumped up. You forgot that my own son was born from my relationship with my brother? What could I do, Margaret? I didn't want to lose you again. David is our son. We loved him very much. But Margaret was no longer listening. What could I do, Margaret? I didn't want to lose you again. David is our son. We loved him very much. But Margaret was no longer listening. The weight of the 30-year lie had collapsed on her. That night, Margaret decided to call Michael. Her brother had moved to another city years ago. They spoke very rarely. When the phone rang, Michael's voice came. Margaret, is that you? Why are you calling at this hour? Michael, we need to talk about David. A long silence came from the other end of the phone. Michael, can you hear me? I can hear you, Michael said, his voice trembling. Did you finally find out? Margaret's heart felt like it had stopped. So, you knew? Of course I knew, Margaret. He's my son. I've been waiting for this day for 30 years. Why did you never call? Why did you never want to see him? Michael's voice broke. Because you were happy. You were happy with Robert. You were happy with David. I couldn't ruin that happiness. But he's your son. No, Margaret. He's your son. Robert's son. I'm just a biological detail. His real father is Robert. Margaret was crying now. Michael, where were you for 30 years? Why did you never? Because I loved you, Margaret, and I hated myself from that day on. You were so weak, so helpless. I took advantage of you. I'll never forgive myself. Margaret hung up the phone. Everything was too complex, too painful. The next day, when David and Lisa came to visit Margaret, they felt the tension the moment they stepped into the house. Both Margaret and Robert looked terrible. Did the DNA results come? David asked. Margaret handed him the envelope. Read it. When David read the first page, he was relieved. So it really wasn't my child. I'm sorry, Mom, you were right. Lisa, you have some things to explain. Lisa started crying. David, Read the second page too, David. Margaret's voice was extremely calm. When David saw the second page, he froze. He read page after page, over and over. Finally, he looked at Margaret. What does this mean? Aren't I your father? No, David, you're not Robert's son. David's world shook. Then, whose son am I? Margaret took a deep breath. Your Uncle Michael's. David collapsed into the chair. Lisa tried to hug him, but David pushed her away. Have you been lying to me for 30 years? Am I not your real child? David, you're our beloved son. Blood ties don't change. Don't they change? David jumped up. Everything changes. I don't even know who I am anymore. Robert couldn't explain to his colleagues at work what had happened. How could he explain that the son he had loved for 30 years was actually his wife's brother's child? David was trying to cope with his own identity crisis. He had to tell his friends, turns out I've been calling the wrong person father for 30 years. The worst part was this. The DNA test Margaret had initiated had not only revealed the father of Lisa's baby, but had made all family ties across 3 generations questionable. One morning, Margaret woke up to find herself completely alone in her house. Robert had spent the night in a hotel. David hadn't come for weeks anyway. Her brother Michael wouldn't answer the phone. A single DNA test had completely destroyed 2 families. Months later, Margaret sat alone in her house thinking about what she had done when she demanded that DNA test that day. Because of her suspicion toward Lisa, she had destroyed her own family. David and Lisa had moved to another city. After they had their baby, they never communicated with Margaret. Margaret had never seen her grandchild. Robert had filed for divorce. "I learned that our 30-year marriage was built on lies," he had said. "I can't continue this." Michael still wouldn't answer the phone. According to what Margaret last learned, her brother had moved to another country. As Margaret looked at the DNA test results in her hand, she thought about how a single decision had changed everything. While wanting to blame her daughter-in-law, she had put herself in a guilty position. When she shouted, "This child is not from our bloodline," to Lisa that day, she had been proven right. But what she didn't know was that her own son was also not from their bloodline. The DNA test had revealed the truth. But some truths were the kind that shouldn't be learned. Margaret now knew. Sometimes knowing was much more painful than not knowing. And those test results had changed 2 families' lives forever. Because some secrets, when revealed, destroyed not only the truth, but everyone as well. This story shows how devastating family secrets can be, and that some truths should not be learned. DNA tests don't just reveal biological facts. Sometimes they also bring decades-old lies to light. Thank you for listening. See you in the next story. Still human.